The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Now, I've titled my talk, The Gandhi You May Not Know, in the belief that most of you know a good deal about Gandhi. I don't know how correct that belief is, but perhaps it is correct. We at least have an idea about who Gandhi was. But maybe there are some angles to his life that I will pass on this evening that might be somewhat new to you. I certainly hope so. I should add that there are many more angles to this man in this big, fat book that you've just seen. This book has just come out in America as an American edition, and it was quite wonderfully welcomed actually in India. It has also had a UK edition, and I'm very pleased that an American edition has come out. And I hope certainly that at least some of you might be interested in getting more about this man. Now, as Ruth Ann has already informed you, when Mohandas Gandhi was a 19-year-old student in London, he met Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, this Irish woman who played a very big role with the Theosophical Society in subsequent years. Actually, Gandhi refers to this encounter with Annie Besant and Madame Blavatsky in his autobiography. He met two theosophists in London at that time. We are now talking about the year 1889. And these two theosophists, one was the uncle of the other, Bertram Keightley and Archibald Keightley. They took young Mohandas in August or September of 1889 to meet Annie Besant, who had just moved from radicalism to theosophy and was very much in the news. And apparently, Madame Blavatsky felt that this was just terrific. The capture of Annie Besant, as she felt it was just great news. And so the Keightley brother, nephew, and uncle pair told Gandhi that this is what is happening, and there's a meeting, and Annie Besant will speak, and Madame Blavatsky will be there. So this young man, 19 years old, he went. He was intrigued by the idea of a former atheist proclaiming her conversion to something new, so he went there. And he always remembered for the rest of his life a remark that Annie Besant made at that time. She said apparently at that meeting, which Gandhi records in his autobiography written decades later, that she had said that I would be content with an epitaph that I lived and died for truth. This is what struck young Mohandas Gandhi. Later on, as some of you will know, he had his 3 years of law studies in the UK. He returns to India, then he goes to South Africa, where he spent 20 years. So in his early years in South Africa, in Durban, he kept for some time, at least, in his office, a photograph of Annie Besant. And then some years later, now Gandhi is 32, he is visiting in India from South Africa. He's kind of made South Africa his base, at least for the time being. He makes a short visit to India during that period. And on that visit, he again seeks out and meets this Irish woman, Annie Besant, who is by this time in the city of Benares, the holy city in India. So he has a meeting with her. She's not very well, but he has a meeting with her there. He returns to South Africa, and then he wages great battles there, and that is where he also discovers this notion of a non-violent fight for justice, to which he gives the expression satyagraha, made up of two Sanskrit words, satya, truth, agraha, firmness for the truth. This was something that Gandhi found, you might say, in South Africa during his period there. And he won some great battles there on behalf of the discriminated against, persecuted Indian minority in South Africa. And then at the age of 45, he returns to India for good. So 3 years in England as a student, 21 years in South Africa, and then the remaining 33 years of his life he spends in India. So when he first arrives in India, people in India have heard of his South African successes, but is of course very strange, very unusual in so many different ways. And people have no idea whether he'll at all have any effect on India's politics or India's life. However, for whatever reason, especially the poor people of India, of different parts of India, flocked to see him. Wherever he went, this newcomer, who'd come from South Africa, had excited a great many people almost from the week of his return to India. Some of you may have heard of this wonderful Indian poet Sarojini Naidu. And this is what Sarojini Naidu says about Gandhi in the year 1917, within a year and a half of his return to India. She speaks of him as a fanciful dreamer of inconvenient and impossible dreams. For surely this sudden appearance of St. Francis of Assisi in his tattered robes in the fastidious purlieus of London or Milan, Paris or Petrograd today, will be scarcely more disconcerting than the presence of this strange man with his bare feet and coarse garments, his tranquil eyes and calm, gentle smile that disclaims even while it acknowledges the homage that emperors cannot buy. But around this time, when he has recently arrived from South Africa, the people in very large numbers are flocking to him and they're wondering what he can do for India with Indians. He has an interesting event where Annie Besant is presiding, and this is in Benares, and she has just helped in the founding of a great university. And this is a meeting where Gandhi and Annie Besant had actually some differences. As a result of that meeting, there were some differences. I'll tell you what happened. This university was being opened, and for this, Annie Besant had worked very hard. She has raised funds, and she collected lots of support, and he was also there. He was invited. So invited to the occasion along with several aristocrats, Indian Rajas, Maharajas, princes. But Gandhi visited the town of Benares, which was not very clean then, and it's not always very clean today, sadly. So Gandhi at this meeting, it was a great meeting, a very kind of prestigious occasion. However, he felt he should speak very frankly about what he had seen. So he spoke about the lack of cleanliness in the city. And then he made some rather controversial statements. He spoke of the quote-unquote richly bedecked noblemen seated on the platform and contrasted them with the millions of the poor. So he wanted to underline his message. He was very frank and very candid, may or may not have been very wise. But Mrs. Besant did not quite like what he was saying. In fact, she asked him to stop speaking. We've just heard about the freedom of expression that we want here. Well, she exercised her freedom as a chairperson to ask the speaker to stop. So this was an interesting incident. By the way, this too is described in that book. Now, this was 1916, so I take you forward to 1919, a very interesting occasion in the city of Amritsar in the Punjab. Now, Amritsar is the holiest city of the Sikhs, but some of you will know what happened there in the year 1919. In April of that year, the worst single incident in the annals of British rule in India occurred on that day, April 13, 1919. When there were about 10,000 people gathered in not a very large square. This square was surrounded on three sides by a wall. There was only one side from where people could come in or where they could go out. And these 10,000 had gathered there. And British General Sir Reginald Dyer and lots of troops under his command, who were mostly Indian troops, came and occupied the only part of this square that was open. And in 10 minutes of firing, 389 Indians, by official count, were killed in 10 minutes. These were Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus. And as I said, it was perhaps the worst single incident in the long period of British rule in India. Before this incident, some maybe 10, 12 days before this incident, something else had happened. Thousands of Indians demonstrating for independence, for freedom of expression, in fact. There was a law against freedom of expression, and Indians led by Gandhi were protesting this. But this very large crowd of demonstrators shouting slogans saying victory to Mahatma Gandhi also turned unruly, in fact turned violent, and 5 Englishmen were killed. And after that, various new laws were introduced, enforced, and this meeting that had collected on April 13, 10,000 people, had come apparently after a proclamation that public meetings were banned. So this was an illegal meeting. According to many reports, many of those who turned up did not know about the ban. But even if they did know, and if they came despite the ban, everybody felt that to shoot at them without any warning and when there was no way for them to escape was too much. However, this is what had happened prior to that incident. Some 5 Englishmen had also been killed. So at the end of that year, December of 1919 now, the Indian National Congress, which is the main political organization conducting the effort for India's independence, has its annual session in the city of Amritsar. And of course, this is by design. In Amritsar, this great tragedy has taken place, so the Indian National Congress has to meet there to express its great pain and outrage, really, at what had happened. So everybody who was anybody in Indian politics was there. And one of the important persons present there was Annie Besant, this Irish woman, who was, as was mentioned by Ruth Hand, very active in the Indian independence movement. And in fact, 2 years previous to this, in December of 1917, she had been the president of the Indian National Congress, the very first woman to be the president of the Indian National Congress. So she was there as a very prominent figure, and various other political figures were present. And Gandhi, who had returned to India now for about 4 years after his South African time, was also there. And so at the meeting of this Indian National Congress in the city of Amritsar in December of 1919, 8 months after those earlier events, a resolution was introduced for discussion. And this resolution condemned what had happened in April 13 in very strong language. It also criticized the earlier violence conducted by the Indian crowds against the Englishmen. So now I'm going to quote to you what a man who was present at this meeting, who was a lawyer from Bombay, a man called K.M. Munshi, a very famous figure later on in India, who was in government and great literary figure. This is his eyewitness account of that meeting, which is discussing this resolution that condemns the April massacre. It also condemns what the Indian crowds had done earlier. I'm quoting him now. The hearts of most of us revolted at the latter part of the resolution. This must have been Mrs. Besant's work, many thought. She was, after all, British. Now, you know, today in India, any person with a white face is thought of as an American. The world has changed, good friends. Today, any white person, whether he could be from, what, Latvia, he is an American. In 1919, any white woman was an English woman. The difference between Irish and English was not very sharply understood. So this must have been Mrs. Besant's work, many thought. After all, she was British. One Punjab leader, Punjab is the region where Amritsar is the big city. One Punjab leader gave expression to the feeling rather crudely. No one born of an Indian mother, said he, could have drafted this resolution. Another leader, the great Tilak, was indignant. So were Pal and Siya Das. And the latter part of the resolution was lost by an overwhelming majority. I'm still reading this eyewitness account. The next day, the president wanted the committee to reconsider the resolution, as Gandhi ji, now ji is, you know, how in India you add that suffix to convey respect. Gandhi ji, he said, was very keen on it. There were vehement protests. Ultimately, Gandhi ji was helped to the table to move that the resolution be reconsidered. He was not very well, so he spoke sitting. Out of respect, the house sat quiet, but with ill-concealed impatience. Referring to the remark that no son born of an Indian mother could have drafted the resolution, Gandhi ji stated that he had considered deeply and long whether as an Indian he could have drafted the resolution, for indeed he had drafted it. But after long searching of the heart, he had come to the conclusion that only a person born of an Indian mother could have drafted it. And then he spoke, continues this man K. Munshi, as if his whole life depended upon the question. When he stopped, we were at his feet. The resolution was reconsidered and accepted in its original form. So this is how Gandhi educated, taught, challenged the Indians to give to their movement a tone, a stamp, a character that would really succeed. And of course, we know that it did succeed. Now I'm going to present to you 4 Gandhis that are not so well known. One is the rational Gandhi, and the other is the man of the ocean Gandhi, you might say the sailor Gandhi. And third is Gandhi, the man of music. And the fourth is Gandhi, the man of attachments. So first, the rational Gandhi. We all know about Gandhi's commitment to his conscience, to the inner voice. If he felt a deep inner urge, he would do it. But then he was also very interested in hard facts and basic data. Some of you are aware of the Salt March of 1930. It was decided that there would be a non-violent fight against British rule. What was not decided was, what was the issue on which we will fight? What exactly? Because you can't say we are against everything that the British are doing. You have, if you're to win a war, you also have to fight a local battle before you win the war. And the battle has to be on a particular terrain. So what is the terrain on which we will fight the British in 1930? So people were getting quite impatient, and Gandhi was wondering. Tagore, the great poet, went to Sabarmati, Gandhi's ashram, and said to Gandhi, what is going to happen? Gandhi said, I don't know. I'm furiously thinking, but I have no idea. Then suddenly he had the inspiration for the Salt March. We all know about, at least those who have studied his life know that he had this kind of inspiration, and the Salt March was in fact an incredible success. But then when he does have the Salt March and he takes his 80-odd associates marching 240 miles from Ahmedabad to the coast, what does he do on that march? He sends out a note to each of the scores of villages along the way, and he demands information ahead of time. You must let me know before I come with my group to your village. 1, population in your village, how many women, and he puts the women first, how many women, how many men, how many Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, how many quote-unquote untouchables in your village, what education are these untouchables getting in your village, the number of boys and girls in the village school, if there is any school in the village, the number of cattle, the number of spinning wheels, the number of people in the village who wear the hand-spun and hand-woven cloth that Gandhi is popularizing, the amount and rate of land revenue, the size of any common grazing ground, the village's consumption of salt, etc. So Gandhi is collecting solid, hard information. Much later, on another march of his, the famous march in the area of Noakhali in what is now Bangladesh, where he went to defend, in this case, Hindus were under attack from Muslims. Here too, he demanded information about each village he was visiting. His grandniece Manu was with him. So was this remarkable anthropologist from Calcutta called Nirmal Kumar Bose, who was translating for Gandhi, Bengali into Hindi or English. And Nirmal Kumar Bose and Manu were forced to do their research in village after village. Therefore, in Manu Gandhi's account of that march across those villages, 47 villages, there is a record of the population of each village, broken down by caste, by religion, by occupation. So the Gandhi, the man who is often driven by his deepest inner urge, is also a kind of a social scientist who is collecting solid information. Okay, the Gandhi, the man of the sea. Now, he was born in this place called Porbandar, which is on the Arabian Sea. So he had this early, you might say, bias in favor of the sea. He's known as the marching Gandhi. There are many statues in India at any rate, and elsewhere too, of the marching Gandhi, staff in hand. And on that salt march, when he preceded Jawaharlal Nehru, his very close political associate, who afterwards became India's first prime minister, this is how he described the start of that march. Today, the pilgrim marches onward on his long trek. Staff in hand, he goes along dusty roads in Gujarat, clear-eyed and firm of step, with his faithful band trudging along behind him. So the marching Gandhi is very well known, often described. But I want to describe to you some of his sea voyages. Some of you are aware of this tract that Gandhi wrote while he was in South Africa, or when he was during that period. He actually wrote it when he was on a ship from England to South Africa in 1909. This tract is called Hind Swaraj, which means Indian home rule or Indian self-rule. And in this tract, among other things, Gandhi very strongly attacks many aspects of modern civilization. He attacks cars, he attacks planes, he attacks trains. He's a kind of an environmentalist there. But he does not attack ships. Earlier we mentioned his stay in England as a law student. After 3 years in England as a law student, he returns to India by ship, and he writes the following in his diary. I could not make myself believe that I was going to India until I stepped into the steamship Oceana of the P&O Company. So much attached was I to London and its environments. For who would not be? London, with its teaching institutions, public galleries, vegetarian restaurants, is a fit place for a student and a traveler. Thus, it was not without regret that I left dear London. So the future foe of empire is writing like this at the age of 21 on that ship. Now, on that voyage, some other things happened, and he himself describes them, and I'm going to relate some of these to you. Remember, he's now 21. He's returning to India, hoping to begin a law career, not sure that he will succeed. He's also trying to improve his writing skills. And while in England, he has made a very good relationship with a journal called The Vegetarian. And the editor of that journal has asked him to write something for the journal. So on the ship, he's describing activities on the ship for this journal. And he affects a very British, mocking, snobbish, understating style. His articles referred to, quote, a crowd of dirty-looking beggars, unquote, who, quote, pester passengers in Malta. Now, can Gandhi write like this? Well, he did. He writes of, quote, rogues and rascals, unquote, encountered in port side. And waiters on the ship who, quote, murder the Queen's English, unquote. And listen to this, and they are the reverse of clean. Gandhi describes the meals in a day of an average passenger. The pre-breakfast tea and biscuits, cookies, English biscuits. A huge breakfast, its elements are detailed. Quote, an easily digestible lunch, unquote, but it's called dinner, he explains, with plenty of mutton and vegetables, rice and curry, pastry and whatnot, fruit and nuts, followed by a refreshing cup of tea and biscuits at 4 p.m. and a high tea at 6:30 p.m. Bread and butter, jam or marmalade, or both, salad, chops, tea, coffee. Thereafter, since the sea air was so very salubrious, the passengers could not retire to bed before taking a very few, only 8 or 10, 15 at the most, biscuits, a little cheese, and some wine or beer, added 21-year-old Gandhi. Some very nice ladies and gentlemen traveled in the first saloon, but it would not do to have all play and no quarrel. So some of the passengers thought fit to get drunk almost every evening. Beg your pardon, Mr. Editor, they got drunk almost every evening, but this particular evening they got drunk and disorderly. So how very, very British this young 21-year-old Gandhi on that ship is. As far as I can make out, this was the first and the last time he wrote in this British, understated, mocking style. Okay, there are other journeys that I won't spend too much time with, but I will mention, okay, this sea voyage. I mentioned to you he's 23 when he goes to South Africa from India, and he discovers great things, a purpose for his life, a weapon for battling injustice. But his family are back in India. He returns to India and takes his family back to South Africa. And on this voyage, this is in 1896, at the end of 1896, Gandhi is now, 27 years old. He takes his family and a few other relatives to South Africa. This voyage, when two boats, the Kurland and the Naderi, sailed together for Durban out of Bombay, is quite well known. It's described in his autobiography. 4 days short of the Natal coast, a violent gale hit the boats. Though the captain of the Kurland said that a well-built ship could stand almost any weather, the passengers became inconsolable. The ships rocked and rolled, and every minute were heard sounds and crashes which foreboded breaches and leaks. In different languages and ways, all prayed, including the captain, to the one and only God. His will be done was the only cry on every lip. Now, many people have speculated that this particular voyage perhaps was the start of the multi-faith prayers that became such a common feature of Gandhi's life, which you're going to have at your next meeting here. Watching Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Parsis praying, if not screaming in different languages, Gandhi sensed that all the messages were aimed at one address. Always a good sailor himself, Gandhi took hourly reports from the captain to the Kurland's passengers and sought to calm them. After 24 hours, the storm cleared, but just ahead was a gale of another sort. When he landed, there was a huge uproar because many of the whites in South Africa felt this man was bringing lots of Indians, and the Indians were going to change the demographics of South Africa. We must push them out, and Gandhi was actually beaten, roughed up. He would have been killed but for a very interesting white woman called Mrs. Alexander who saved his life. Now, in 1906, that's when Gandhi discovers, and I won't go into the details of that because I'm going to tell you about the Gandhi you may not know. How he found Satyagraha is better known, and I won't go into that. But I will mention this, that the first meeting that decided to defy this law non-violently in South Africa, a great big meeting held in a theater in Johannesburg, was held on September 11, 1906. A couple of months or so after that, Gandhi goes from South Africa to England to negotiate with British rulers to see if pressure could be applied from London on the British rulers, white rulers in South Africa, for the sake of the Indian minority there. And he writes about this voyage of his in the journal that he started in South Africa. This is called Indian Opinion, and he has it in several languages to reach the different groups of Indians in South Africa. And he writes about this journey and the ship in which he is traveling. It's called the Armadale Castle. The ship is as big as a small town. There must be about 1,000 persons aboard, but there is no noise, no disorder. The English lawyer or businessman who had only recently trekked long distances in the Zulu War, who felt happy with dry bread, now did no work on the ship. He presses a button, and attendant stands before him. Why indeed should such a people not rule? So he's describing this to the Indians of South Africa. And then 3 years later, he makes another trip from South Africa to England and comes back. And that is when he writes this great tract, Hind Swaraj, about which I've already mentioned. And on that voyage from England to South Africa in 1909, he wrote this book. He just wrote it continuously. He felt he was being inspired. He wrote without ceasing. When his right hand got tired, he wrote with his left hand. Nothing was scratched out. In addition, he also translated on that voyage a very long epistle written by Tolstoy called A Letter to a Hindu, which Gandhi translated. As you know, Tolstoy also had quite an influence on Gandhi's life. And then there was this voyage in 1914. Start in December 14. In January 15, he was in India. And this is when he was returning to India for good. And he had to come to India with a plan, with a strategy on how he would try and change India. And this was the only time that he and his wife were traveling, just the two of them together. Otherwise, Gandhi was always with associates, co-workers, colleagues. This was the only time ever that Mohandas Gandhi and Kasturba Gandhi traveled together. So it's a very special kind of voyage. For the first time since their marriage, Kasturba had her husband wholly to herself. The children had left earlier. There were no co-workers on board. They greatly missed Kallenbach, the Jewish architect of German origin who had given Gandhi great support in South Africa, who had planned to come with them, but then because he was of German origin, the war had started, so the British said this Kallenbach would not be given a visa for India, so he couldn't come. So Gandhi writes to Kallenbach, the only thing to complete our happiness would be your presence. We always talk about you. Then Gandhi writes to Kallenbach, before retiring, I invariably read the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, and I sing one hymn. Now, I mention this not to remind you of Gandhi's religious practices, but that he also enjoys singing to himself. So I rather like to imagine the Mohandas and Kasturba on this ship called the Arabia, on the brink of a very large undertaking, doesn't know what will happen. Kasturba having him all to herself, and he, always a good sailor, finding pleasure in the voyage, and singing each night a prayer song as the ship plowed its way across the waters. So, yes, there's one other voyage I will mention. He's back in India now. In 1931, he goes to England for negotiations for what was called the Round Table Conference. The ship is called the Rajputana. He took many with him this time, his secretary Mahadev Desai, his son, my father Devdas, his other secretary Pyarelal, his friend and supporter Ghanshyam Das Birla, and his British associate Madeline Slade, or Mira Ben as she came to be known, who was 39 at this time. Since Mira's father was an important admiral in the navy of the British Empire, she was familiar with the sea and with ships. She assessed that as a sailor on the Rajputana, Gandhi was, quote, out and away the best among the party. When a cheeky young fellow passenger presented Gandhi with what he called a journal named Scandal Times and asked for comments, Gandhi removed the pin from the sheets, returned the sheets, kept the pin, and said, thank you very much. Now, I've already mentioned that Gandhi enjoyed singing these prayer songs to himself. But I want to mention a few words about Gandhi and music. He has mentioned in the autobiography how as a very small boy, he came across, somebody came to the house. This happens still in India. People come from the street and they sing before you. This particular person came and sang the story of Shravan with a pole across his shoulder and the baskets hanging down from the pole, its ends, and his father sitting in one basket, the mother in the other basket. And it's a very well-known and sad story. So the Gandhi writes in the autobiography, "The melting tune moved me deeply, and I played it on a concertina which my father had purchased for me." So I like to imagine little young Gandhi playing this tune. And when, as an 18 or 19-year-old, he's a student in London, he engages tutors for dancing, French, violin. Then he, of course, suspends that experiment. He says, "This is not for me." And he says, violin could be learnt even in India. Here I am to study law, so I must focus on that. But the interesting thing is that Gandhi does imagine, although he never carried out this wish, that when he returns to India and has more time and fewer immediate commitments, he would learn the violin. And during his South African time also, there are many instances where he turns to music for solace. There's one occasion, by the way, when he was in South Africa, Gandhi had the distinction of being almost done to death by a white crowd, an Indian crowd, and a black crowd. So it was multiracial in the attacks on him. And on this occasion, when some Indians were very angry with him for some particular reason, for sticking to nonviolence really, and they knocked him down, and he could have died, but he didn't. And then a Briton called Joseph Doak, who was a Baptist minister, who had befriended Gandhi, and Gandhi had befriended him, he takes the unconscious Gandhi to his home outside Johannesburg. And there, a Gandhi who is revived gives instructions that the people who have attacked him should not be persecuted, should not be prosecuted, beg your pardon. A doctor treats him, but he's quite unwell, and he's ordered by the doctor not to speak. But he then says to Joseph Doak, "Please ask your daughter to sing me this song." Little daughter, Olive. And this is, yes, it is a religious song. It's the one of Gandhi's favorite kind of Western sacred songs, "Lead Kindly Light Amid the Encircling Gloom." And the girl sang the song, and 20 years later, Gandhi says, "All my life, I can never forget the whole scene and the melodious voice of little Olive as she sang that song." And then when he's in India too, when he's in prison, he often sings to himself. Often he's in a solitary cell, and he does sing to himself. Yes, these are, you might say, religious songs, sacred songs, but they're songs nonetheless, and they're musical nonetheless. And there are other instances of this. When he went to London for the 1931 Round Table Conference, I should be finishing soon, shouldn't I? Yes. Yes. He was in England for this conference. He stayed in a poor quarter in London with Muriel and Doris Lester, two sisters. Muriel Lester organized, quote, "a joy night when humble folk from the East End of London could have some amusement. A woman called Martha Rollison patted Gandhi on the shoulder and said, 'Come on, Mr. Gandhi, let's have a dance.' According to Muriel Lester, Gandhi looked awfully pleased to be asked, but he did not try to dance. At the Dorchester Hotel, the maitre called Charles greeted Gandhi, reminding him that they had taken dancing lessons together when Gandhi was a student in London. Gandhi, remembered, exclaimed, 'Charlie!' A reporter from the Evening Standard asked Gandhi if he intended to see plays in London. Listen to Gandhi's answer as published in the newspaper. "At one time, I used to attend the Lyceum. I liked Shakespeare's plays. I adored the incomparable Ellen Terry. I worshipped her, but that was before the advent of melodrama. The only reason I will not attend theaters in London this time is because I shall not have time. I'm not the dreadful old man I'm represented to be. Actually, I'm a very jolly fellow. I can almost be described as Scotch. I'm very careful of my sixpences." Towards the very end of his life, 48 in Delhi, one evening his friend and wonderful singer Dilip Kumar Roy, he comes to sing at Gandhi's prayer meeting. And here is what Dilip Kumar Roy would later write. "After the meeting, I made my last obeisance on the lawn of Birla House. He looked at me tenderly with gentle, sad eyes and said, 'It was good, that song.' I know you had a special liking for that song, said Roy. He sighed, Gandhi sighed. When do I hear you next? Tomorrow? I must fly tomorrow for Calcutta. He smiled. Well, if you must, you must. And that's the end of it, but I will miss you tomorrow. When I left him, my eyes were moist with tears. I was moved by him as never before. So then there are other examples of, we know of how Gandhi looked after India. He adopted all of India as his family, and as a result, his wife and sons did suffer, no doubt about that. But there are instances also of Gandhi's very deep attachment to his wife and his sons. His longing for a kind of family life that he was not destined to have. But he was attached, but he conquered that attachment because of what he felt his task in the world, his task for the world was. So I think I will end with that, and thank you very much.
Would you engage some questions from the audience?
Sure.
So, raise your hand, and I'm going to bring this mic to you so that we can get these on the webcast. Can you hear this? Yes. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for a question to arise, I was just thinking that it's very interesting that not only has your book been published right now, this is 60 years after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, but also the 1979 Philip Glass opera is now at the Metropolitan in New York, right? As a matter of fact, if any of you are going to be in New York tomorrow night, I believe it's playing tomorrow night.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you just describe briefly your relationship to your grandfather as a boy? If you may have written about it, but I haven't read about it.
I was 12 and a half when he was killed. I was also in the same town where he was last phase of his life. He spent about a year in the period of 2.5 years, final period of his life, in New Delhi, which is where I was going to school as a boy. My father was a newspaper editor in New Delhi. And my older sister, my two younger brothers, and I then had the chance to see him many times during that period. That was the period when I saw him quite frequently. Before that, he was either in prison or he was trying to put out fires in different parts of India. And there were brief occasions earlier when I was with him, but this was the the extended period where I interacted with him. It was not a period where I had one-on-one occasions with him. I know that today there is the widely accepted and I think perfectly appropriate view, family first. But that was not Gandhi's motto. But perhaps almost because of that, whenever he did see his family, he was very, very endearing and affectionate to them. In that final phase of his life, remember India is getting independence, but India is also getting partitioned. And there is considerable violence in the land. And the violence hits Hindus and Sikhs, it hits Muslims. Hindus and Sikh refugees have come to India from Pakistan. Muslims in Delhi are feeling very insecure, are being pushed out. So he is meeting people from both aggrieved communities. People are losing lives. So he can't afford to spend too much time with his son and his grandchildren. He has to attend to these people. But he does show great warmth to me and my siblings. And one special time we had was before the kind of 5 o'clock multi-faith prayer meeting, which used to be held not far from where his room was. So we would arrive to be with him walk with him a couple of 100, 300 yards, 600 feet to this prayer meeting, spend the prayer time together with him, about half an hour, 40 minutes, which is a very instructive time in many ways, and then walk back with him, and a lot of banter and fun on the way to and the way back. But once you were there on the site of the prayer, you had to become very serious and still and quiet and respectful. One interesting, yes, you know, the traditional Indian way for youngsters to greet their older relatives is to bow respectfully before them. It's not just a formal thing, it's both an affectionate but also a respectful way of greeting. And the older person then either puts one hand or both hands on your head and caresses your head or blesses you. But his way of blessing and greeting me was to give a great thump on my back. Now, he was not very strong, he was old, he was often fasting, but still his thump was quite memorable. And he would, take every chance to have some fun. He would tease his grandchildren. And my youngest brother was then only 2 or 2.5, and he was learning new tricks every day, and he was also learned how to mimic his grandfather, and his grandfather enjoyed mimicking him. So that was a very special occasion to see these two. Of course, I felt a little bit left out, but that was that. But perhaps the strongest memory of that period is at this prayer meeting. The format of this was like this. There would be prayer verses, short verses from different religions. There would be a moment of silence, meditation. And then there would be a prayer song also. Gandhi was very keen that people should not be bored. There was a limit to people's patience. And then he would speak on burning national issues to whoever was present. And these were sometimes hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people. And by this time, what he was saying was also being aired on India's official radio, because the government was led by his followers by this time. So I would be with him at the prayer meeting, often seated quite close to him, and together we would face the audience. Of course, there were others also sitting on this platform. And then sometimes there would be protests. Remember, I've mentioned what the climate was. There was violence, bitterness, suspicion. And one of the earliest, the very first thing in Gandhi's prayers was a Buddhist chant. Nam Myo Horenge Kyo. And this next item was from the Holy Quran, the opening chapter, Fatiha. It's a short chapter. Those who know it know how wonderful it is. And when that was recited, sometimes some angry people would get up and say, we won't allow this. You must not have the Quran because people have killed our relatives in the name of the Quran. So Gandhi would say to them, the others don't seem to mind. Then he would say, what do all think? This is what the opinion is. What does everybody else think? And people would say, of course we don't mind. Go ahead. Then he would say to the objectors, see, others don't mind. Why don't you go along with what the others say? So often they would agree. But there were moments where they did not agree. So Gandhi would then say, all right, if you won't allow me to have the Quran, I won't then also have the Gita. And I will proceed straight to my post-prayer talk. Sometimes those who were protesting were angry enough to make people like me, boys like me, somewhat concerned. What if these people came and attacked him, knocked him down? He had no bodyguards or security persons. So I would ask myself if I was in a position to help him, if any attack came. So that is my most powerful memory of his teaching lessons in democracy to the prayer audience, but also you might say, almost his warmth to people who were angry at him. This is what kind of surprised me, that these people are sort of shouting at him, but he's not shouting back at them. And then also that he's not afraid. He's not afraid.
I had one question. It's more historical, perhaps. I was reading recently about one of the other, person who had participated in the, in the movement in India, C. Rajagopalachari. It was just a coincidental. My grandfather and he had spent time in the Vellore jail in the 1920s.
What's your grandfather's name?
Venkatakrishna Rao, Kodagiri Venkatakrishna Rao. He was from Andhra Pradesh.
Famous person, yes.
Yeah. So the part that he talked about in his jail memory was he thought there was considerable empathy in the population, and when they were arrested and put in jail, the people didn't rise. So how, considering a lot of this was done by educated intellectuals, how did they get the masses to participate, in the movement?
Well, that's a great question. For one thing, the desire for independence was very widely felt, was of long standing. So Gandhi, or nobody was needed to ask people to be interested in independence. What did men like Gandhi do? For one thing, and this is the assessment of quite a few scholars, that he was effective in getting fear out of people. Fear of being beaten, fear of being sent to prison, fear of losing property. So this doesn't explain the sympathy that the movement had, but it explains the participation by hundreds of thousands of people. Until Gandhi's arrival on the scene, there were two broad methods. One was to request the British government to be gentler, kinder. The other was to assassinate a few people. The petitioning and praying didn't take people very far. And assassinating, in fact, produced fierce reprisals which brought great suffering. So when Gandhi came, he offered a third way, where you didn't lose your self-respect, you were able to say no. But you also didn't kill or attack or destroy or throw bombs. And therefore, if a nonviolent activist was arrested, the people in his or her village or town were not attacked. There were no reprisals against the people. Whereas when a violent man was arrested, or when a violent man disappeared after throwing a bomb, that whole village was punitively, you might say, dealt with by the government. So the Indian people felt that this man is giving us a method where we don't have to humiliate ourselves, abase ourselves. We don't have to invite unbearable suffering. We just have to have the courage to say no and to take a certain amount of suffering. I think this is one way of explaining this remarkable phenomenon. Sir.
Here in the States, Martin Luther King has been compared to Gandhi in terms of the nonviolent approach. In recent times, King has started an ascendancy in terms of the impression of the people here in the States. My question is, does Gandhi still have that resonance in India?
One way of judging somebody's resonance, relevance, popularity, currency is how they fare in popular movies. And some months ago, there was a movie made which introduces Gandhi in a very unexpected way. It was an unbelievable box office success. And that triggered something very remarkable in different parts of India. So yes, Gandhi is enjoying quite a resurgence in India today, although not everything that's happening in India is very Gandhian. Yes?
How might we apply Gandhi's message today in the U.S. To appeal to our leaders towards peace?
I think that's a question I should be asking all of you. It's a great question. But it's not just in the US, all over the world. I think we sometimes feel that anger, hatred, violence is the way to bring peace, but it very, very seldom is, if ever. And well, I guess, there's so many things in all parts of our world which need change and addressing. Every city in America has its issues. Every part of America has its issues. And now, of course, there are these great economic challenges. But I think there is something also which Americans have to address, which is America's relationship to the rest of the world. Despite all the enormous challenges, difficulties of life in America, America's relationship with the world is very, very important. And to me, it's an amazing thing how this incredible country, sheltered by the oceans, blessed by Providence, has done so wonderfully well in so many ways. And human life is still quite remarkably preserved, protected in this country. But then, what about the rest of the world? So I think America has to understand that a life of an individual outside America is also as precious as the life of an individual inside the United States. There's much more that I can say in those general lines, but in terms of actual strategies, I think we should do what Gandhi did, collect lots of information and data about different places, and then also seek inspiration. Gandhi had this flair for discovering not only the goal, but also the precise strategy, the precise tactic. And it doesn't mean that the same thing should apply in every part of America. But as long as there are people who are asking that question and meeting as groups to see what in their area they can do, and if they feel what can be done across America as a whole, I wish I had kind of formulae for success there. I don't. But I share your very strong feeling that some way has to be found to do this. So thank you for your question.